Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be revisiting the FIDE World Cup, which is being held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, as you guys know, Magnus Carlsen, the five-time former world chess champion, that doesn't sound right, but it is what it is facing off against the Indian junior Gukesh. Now, as we know, Magnus won a very nice game yesterday, played an endgame specialty, and he's leading 1-0 as they play the second game today with the colors reversed. Magnus needing only a draw with the white pieces to advance to the semifinals. So let's jump right into the action. So Magnus opens with e4. Gukesh plays c5 here, and now we get the move c3 from Magnus. Now, c3 is known as the c3 Sicilian or the Alpine Sicilian in older times. It's a very solid system where white tries to claim the center immediately with c3 and d4. Now, one interesting thing to note is that there was another match between Arjun Erigaisi and Ramesh Babu Pragnanantha, where Arjun was leading 1-0 as well, and Arjun opened with e4, needing only a draw with the white pieces. And Prag played c5, Arjun played the c3 Sicilian or the Alpine, and Arjun actually got outplayed in a very long endgame and lost, so that match is tied 1-1, but it speaks to the solid nature of playing this move c3 instead of going to the main lines with like knight f3 and d4 and the open Sicilian. So we get c3 from Magnus. Gukesh plays d5, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and now d4 played by white, or Magnus here, with the idea of playing knight to f3 and easy development in the center of the board. Gukesh goes knight f6. We get knight to f3, pawn to e6 here. Now, one interesting thing is black has a couple of options. You can try to bring the bishop out to g4 right away here. You can also play e6, leaving the bishop inside the pawn chain here. Or you can even play knight c6 right away. Now, many different options. I think even bishop f5 might be possible, although I think it's a little bit dubious in this exact position. At any rate, Gukesh plays e6, and now Magnus makes a very interesting decision to play bishop e2. Now, I have had this position many times online. I think Daniel Naroditsky has also done some speed runs with this opening, and in this position, the main line is this move knight to a3. Now, the reason that knight to a3 is considered to be the best move is quite straightforward. With the knight on a3, you can support either bishop to c4, attacking the queen, or you can go for knight b5 with the idea of knight c7 or knight c2 and knight e3. So you support a lot of different ideas by putting the knight on a3. If black takes on d4 after knight to b5, threatening the family fork with knight to c7 here, black either has to play knight to a6, after which queen takes d4, and knight takes d4 gives white a small advantage due to the knight being on the rim here, or black has to play a move like queen to d8, stopping knight c7. And once again, after queen takes d4, white should have no problems here. In fact, with queens coming off the board, I think white has a big advantage. And I think for a player like Magnus, he would have loved to have gone straight into the endgame, especially in a situation where a draw is enough to move on. However, Magnus decides to play bishop e2 instead, and now we get pawn takes pawn on d4. Magnus takes back with the pawn so that he can finish his development with the knight. It's a little bit different here after queen takes d4, because if you trade the queens in this situation, after black plays a6, stopping knight b5 here, black has a slightly better pawn structure here due to being able to play something like e5 down the road, and then finishing his development with knight c6, bishop to f5, and castling the queen out of the center of the board. So Magnus takes with the pawn. We get knight c6, castles, bishop to e7, knight to c3, attacking the queen. Magnus could have played knight c3 right away, but perhaps he didn't want to allow bishop b4, pinning the knight on c3. So we get castles, bishop e7, knight to c3, queen d6 played by Gukesh. We get knight to b5 here. Now, one interesting thing, and I mentioned this during the live stream when I was covering the event, is that many years ago, in the year 1997, I played in the World Youth Chess Festival, or 1998, sorry, I played in the World Youth Chess Festival in Oropesa del Mar in Spain. Now, in that event, I played against a player from Portugal. I believe his name was João Alcosta. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation. But for that game, one of the systems that he played was this Alpine Sicilian with c3. And I looked at a very specific setup with black, which is to play something like queen d6 with castles, bishop d7, let's say rook f d8, a3, rook a c8, followed by queen to b8, let's say bishop f1, bishop e8, h3, bishop f8, g3, and the knight to e7 with ideas like bishop c6 and knight e or knight f to d5. Now, I think I've mentioned this story before, but nonetheless, when I saw Gukesh play queen d6, it brought back shades of that game and that preparation I did nearly 26 long years ago. At any rate, in this game, after queen d6, Magnus plays knight b5 right away, trying to attack the queen and forcing Gukesh to move the queen from this optimal square. Gukesh plays queen to d8. Magnus goes bishop f4, trying to play knight c7, forking the king and the rook here. In this position, knight d5 is played, attacking the bishop and covering the c7 square. Magnus plays bishop g3, Gukesh castles, and now Magnus plays this move rook c1. Now at this point, we've reached sort of the stable middle game position here where Magnus has a slight weakness, this isolated pawn on d4 that's blockaded by this pawn and this knight. Now this pawn can be a strength or it can be a weakness. In this case, it's not really clear which one it is. So Gukesh plays bishop d7, Magnus plays knight to c3, bringing the knight back and trying to trade the knights off. Gukesh plays queen to b6. Now, this is the first move that I think is perhaps a little bit dubious, but based on the match situation of Gukesh needing to win this game to stay alive, it makes a lot of sense. Bishop f6 is probably a little bit more solid, but after knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, now we have a symmetrical pawn structure in the middle of the board, and after a move like knight to e5, we're going to see some knights and some bishops potentially get traded here, and with all these pieces coming off the board, Gukesh will have no chances to win the game. So, here Gukesh plays queen b6, Magnus plays bishop c4, an excellent move asking Gukesh what are you doing with your knight in the center of the board. Now if Gukesh were to trade the knights, he actually helps White's pawn structure because the pawns on c3 and d4 guard each other, whereas here this pawn is an isolated weakness. So Gukesh doesn't want to do that, A, because it helps Magnus improve the pawn structure, but it also trades off pieces. So Gukesh plays knight to f6, and Magnus goes knight to a4, guarding the pawn on b2, but also attacking the queen at the same time. Gukesh plays queen to a5, and now Magnus goes knight to c5 here, trying to put pressure on both the pawn on b7 and the bishop on d7 at the same time. Now here Gukesh retreats the bishop to guard the pawn. He does not try to grab a free pawn here by trading and taking, because White can create the classic fossil with bishop takes e6, attacking the bishop and the queen, or even bishop d6, winning the rook or the queen as well. So bishop c8 is played here by Gukesh. Magnus plays a3, Gukesh plays queen d8. He does not play rook d8 here because after rook to d8, I think White can play this weird retreating move bishop d3 with the idea of playing b4, and the queen is a little bit loose here on a5, and if you were to take on d4, you lose the game right away. There are probably multiple options that win, but probably simplest is bishop takes h7 check, attacking the king, and after you take the bishop, queen takes d4. White simply has a rook for a bishop and should win the game. So Gukesh plays queen d8, Magnus goes bishop b5, and this is the first move where Magnus loses the threat. Up to this point, Magnus is playing a pretty much flawless game. He's played most of the top computer suggestions, but here he goes wrong with bishop b5. What Magnus should have played was this move bishop to d3, retreating to put pressure on this diagonal towards the pawn, or bishop to a2, protecting the knight on c5, and trying to use this half-open c-file. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. If you were to play a move like h3, black can potentially take the pawn on d4, because after knight takes knight and bishop takes knight, black is simply up a pawn. So Magnus sees this threat of knight takes d4 and moves the bishop, but the reason this move is so good here is that if White goes bishop d3, black is struggling to develop these pieces on the queen side. If you move the bishop, you hang the pawn. If you push the pawn, I can maybe even take here on e6, take on c6, and White has an extra pawn. So you can't really easily develop the bishop and the rook here since you can't push the pawn, and White has a substantial spatial advantage as well. Now, it's also worth pointing out that Gukesh has moved his queen a lot of times in the game. He's moved his queen, I believe, 7 or 8 times already, and if you get this position, we can compare this with an earlier situation where right back here, let's take a look at this position. In this position, White has his knight on b5, which is not very well placed. It can't jump to c7 or d6 here, and it's probably just going to have to retreat to c3. Black has ideas like bishop d7 or b6, etc. And so it seems like black is doing fine. So now when you go back to this position in the game right here, let's put the bishop on d3. You'll notice that here the knight on c5 is very well placed, and black's pieces are back on their original squares, and White has the bishop on d3. He's got the great knight on c5. He also has a3 to support a b4 pawn push. So all the trumps in this position are in favor of Magnus. But instead he plays bishop b5, which isn't really a bad move per se, but after queen to b6 attacking the bishop again, it starts to get very tricky here, because if you move the bishop to like a4, for example, black can capture this pawn on b2, so you don't really want to move the bishop. You also don't really want to take the knight, because after queen takes knight, knight e5, and queen d5, black is going to play a move like b6 next turn to kick the knight out of c5, and after bishop to b7, knight f4, and queen d8, black has the bishop pair here, and he can once again blockade this pawn on d4, and black has a sizable advantage according to Stockfish. So Magnus plays this move a4 instead, supporting the bishop and not letting black capture the pawn. Gukesh plays rook d8, an excellent move, trying to pressure the pawn on d4 here, and now Magnus goes queen to e2. Here, Gukesh uses a bit of time before playing rook d5, which is another move that I really, really like. Knight takes d4 is maybe possible, trying to grab a pawn here, but after knight takes knight, rook takes knight, and this move knight to b3, black has to be very careful. If you move the rook to d5, after bishop c7, spaghetti-o, your queen is actually completely trapped here. You simply have no squares, and you will resign the game very politely. And if you play rook to e4 attacking the queen here, white can sack the queen for the rook and go bishop c7 anyway. And in this resulting endgame, after black takes the bishop and you take the queen, white again will have a rook for a bishop and should win in the near future. So Gukesh plays rook d5 here, which is a move I really like because now black is trying to create a lot of chaos, put pressure on the pawn on d4, the knight on c5, and it feels very tricky to play. Here, Magnus spends a couple of minutes before taking on c6, and he starts to lose the thread here. Now, this position is very scary, and one of the things that I've said that Magnus struggles at times are deep calculations, and more specifically, situations where there's a lot of chaos, and you don't have clear-cut plans and positions that feature tactics. So, the computer actually thinks you can play rook fd1 here, and you're doing fine, but it's a very tough move to play, because after knight takes d4, let's say you take with the rook, takes, bishop takes c5, after a move like knight b3, black has this nice move, bishop d6 here, not bishop b4, because then the same tactic would apply, where you lose the queen. But after bishop d6, a5, queen d8, rook d1, knight d5, suddenly black is up a pawn here in the center of the board, and white is still okay, but it feels like it can get very scary. So Magnus kind of feeling a little bit uncomfortable here, getting slightly low on time. He decides to trade the bishop for the knight, and this is a fairly serious mistake. Because after queen takes bishop, now black has the two bishops. So if black can ever finish his development, black will be better due to the two bishops and this weak pawn on d4. Here, Magnus plays b3, trying to protect the pawn on a4, and now Gukesh plays rook to d8. Gukesh does not need to hurry here because he understands with the two bishops and this isolated pawn, if he can ever finish this development on the queen side, he will have the advantage. So he goes rook to d8. Magnus plays this move bishop to h4 here. And now we get this move queen to d5, trying to sidestep some fossils. Let's say black plays a5. After takes, and knight e4. Due to this fossil, let's say queen d5, takes, and queen e3. White should be better. So Gukesh plays queen d5. Magnus goes rook fe1. Now you will also notice at this point, Magnus getting low on time, feeling a little bit uncomfortable. He's down 20 minutes, and it's because black has the bishop pair. Magnus has these serious weaknesses. All three of these pawns are a little bit weak here, and it's feeling kind of dangerous. So we get b6. Knight to e4 played by Magnus. Gukesh goes bishop to b7. He does not take the pawn on b3 here because after queen takes pawn, white has knight to e5, and these knights are jumping here. There's a big threat of knight to c6 hitting the bishop and the rook, and there are all kinds of problems on this diagonal. If black plays a move like bishop to b7 here, after knight takes f6, g takes f6, rook to c7, white is winning due to the classic kebab on the 7th rank, and everything starts to fall apart for black. So here Gukesh plays bishop to b7, finishing his development or coming close to it, only needs one more move with rook c8. Magnus takes a knight, Gukesh captures. Gukesh would have loved to have taken with the pawn here, but after pawn takes bishop, there's rook to c7, attacking both of the bishops. And after you play rook d7, trying to trade the rooks, white can play knight c3, queen d6, and knight to b5, attacking the queen. Now, you could make a repetition here, and the game would end in a draw, but Gukesh has to win, and that's not enough. And if you sack the queen by taking the rook, on first glance, it looks like black has great chances with the two rooks and the two bishops, and more particularly the wooden shield here, but white probably is okay. So Gukesh takes with the bishop. We get knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, and now Magnus goes queen to e3, potentially trying to go queen f4 or queen to h6 to target the pawn on the f6 square. Gukesh plays rook c8, and at this point, the dust has somewhat settled. Gukesh has finished his development. Magnus still has these weaknesses on d4 and b3. Black king relatively safe on g7, so it's feeling like Gukesh has gotten everything he wanted, and he's up 15 minutes on the clock. Magnus plays h3 here, creating the lift for the king, so there are no ice skaters on the back rank. We get queen to f5, and now Magnus plays knight to h2 here, trying to go for knight g4, putting pressure on the pawns on e6 and f6. Gukesh plays queen g5, correctly understanding that the knight is completely offsides here on h2. So if Magnus trades the queens, again, you're going to struggle to protect this pawn on d4. And if you play a move like rook d1, there are many ways black is better, but one of the simplest is to go bishop d5, targeting this pawn on b3. And with all these weaknesses on the queen side, it's very questionable whether white can save the game. So Magnus plays knight g4 here, and now Gukesh plays this move king to g7. We get pawn to a5, and here Gukesh misses a great opportunity to reach a quote-unquote technically winning endgame. Now, again, without being a stockfish or seeing the endgame from very far away, it's hard to understand why h5 is so good here. But after h5, Magnus has no choice but to trade the queens. If you try to move the knight away, it's checkmate in 1 with queen takes g2, and otherwise I just capture your knight. So after queen takes, queen, pawn takes, and a move like knight to e3, for example, now after rook takes d4, rook c8, bishop c8, and this move rook to c1, bishop d7, let's just say rook c7, takes, a4, takes. Computer actually thinks this is very close to lost for white, because after rook b7 and a move like king g6, followed by h4 and f5, the pawns are rolling up the center of the board here, and black will get great chances to win the game. Now you're probably wondering, well, so what? What's the big deal? Now the big deal is that when Gukesh here plays this move queen takes queen, Magnus captures with the knight, not with the pawn, by the way, because now this diagonal is completely open. If you capture with the pawn here, black can simply take the pawn, and due to these threats on the second rank towards his pawn and the king on g1, white is in a lot of trouble. So Magnus takes with the knight, bringing the knight back towards the center of the board. Gukesh takes the pawn. We get the trade. Rook c1, bishop d7, rook c7, takes, a4, takes. And now we've reached the endgame where black has the 4-on-3 on the king's side, but the pawns are doubled. And so unlike the other variation where the pawns were undoubled, because the pawns are doubled on f7 and f6, it's very questionable whether black can win this game. Here, we get rook to a5 being played by Magnus. An excellent move trying to stop black from pushing p. You'd love to play f5 here, but white has a tactic with rook takes pawn. You can't check because I just take your rook. And if you take the rook, takes king f6, knight d4, suddenly white's the one trying to win with the extra pawn. So you can't go f5. So Gukesh plays king g6. Magnus plays g4, and now the problem is, how do you push these pawns forward? You'd love to play h5, but here it simply hangs a pawn. If you push f5 after takes, even though the pawn hangs on f5, let's assume I don't take, even in this position with the double pawns, it's very hard to progress. So after g4, it's very hard to push either h5 or f5, and at this point, I think it's very close to being a draw with perfect play. The reason as well is that if you try to trade the bishop for the knight here, you can reach an endgame like this. And this endgame with the 4-on-3 is once again a draw due to all these pawns being on the same side of the board. Now, I'm not saying this would be drawn every time in human practice, but with perfect play, it will be a draw. And for this reason, Gukesh in a must-win situation cannot go for this. So we get this position after bishop c6, rook c5. Gukesh plays bishop to e4, and now Magnus plays king to h2. And the problem, again, is how do you push these pawns forward? Now, there really are only a couple of ways. One way to try and do it is to play f5 here, but after takes, king g3, the double pawns are bad. You can't play h5, so you can play e5 here. Now, this is probably the move that I would have recommended if I were playing the game, because after rook to a5, you can now go h5, and try to trade the pawns, maybe try to put the pawn on h4 and get some kind of rook d2, maybe some kind of checkmate in the corner. Again, should be a draw, but there are chances. White probably should play king g3 to stop h4, and again, it should be a draw with correct play, but maybe better chances than in the game. Because in the game, what we get here is we get the situation where Gukesh plays rook d3, we get king g3, and now he plays f5. I would also add one other important note about this endgame is after bishop d5 takes f5, let's say you even get this endgame here with the 3-on-2. I actually had this endgame multiple times on the side with one less pawn in the candidates in 2016. I had it against Peter Savitler. I drew in that one. I lost this endgame against Levon Aronian later on in the tournament. But this endgame with perfect play is a draw. So Gukesh has all these thoughts in his mind about the endgame, and he doesn't want to trade off. So we get rook d3, king g3, f5 played here, and now Magnus plays king f4, not even letting Gukesh get the 3 versus 2 with the bishop versus the knight. But after king f4, the game is effectively a draw now because you can't ever unstack these pawns. If you take on g4, you hang the bishop on e4. And after you play a move like rook to d2, for example, there are many ways for white to save it, but king g3 is the simplest once again, because if you trade on g4, you're struggling to push the pawns. You can play f5, but now you only have 2 pawns versus 1, and again, this should be a draw. Essentially, the only way you can win here is if you can keep as many pawns on the board as possible, but you're struggling to keep them on the board, and after this, you'll have to play f5 because you can't go h5, and eventually this will be a draw as well. So here Gukesh plays f6, Magnus takes on f5, Gukesh captures with the bishop, Magnus takes, we get pawn takes, and now Magnus plays his move f3. Now rook takes f5 would be a draw, but Magnus probably was worried about the boogeyman or seeing some ghosts here, because after rook d4, king e3 takes, and king d4, it's very easy to get scared by a move like king f4 and king f3. Now this would be a draw, to be clear, because white's king gets over to capture the pawn on h7. But if you know that this endgame is a draw, why do you want to risk some kind of basic oversight in a king and pawn endgame when you know that you'll draw this 100 times out of 100 with f3? So we get f3. Gukesh plays rook to d4, Magnus goes king g3, and now Gukesh plays king g5 with the idea of playing h5. Here Magnus plays rook c2, Gukesh plays h5, we get rook to a2, and now he plays this move f4. Now at this point, this is a theoretical draw. It doesn't matter what black does here, you cannot win. The two chances black has are either h4, f4. You can go h4 with the idea of king to f4, but the problem is white just waits forever on the second rank, and you can't check. If you ever go rook d3, I simply check the king back, and then I go rook b2 and I wait. And if you don't bring the king forward, I just keep sitting forever on the second rank, and this will be a draw because black cannot make any progress. So Gukesh goes for the other one with f4. We get king to g2, and now he plays king h4. We get king to h2, and now he plays rook d7. Now the reason that king h2 is an important move here is, let's just say rook b2. Rook to d7 is played here. In this position, it's still a draw after king to h2 because after rook d3, you can wait on g2. But if you're not careful and you play a move like rook a2, after rook g7 check, king h2 and rook g3, suddenly white is probably losing the game. So here Magnus goes king h2. We get rook d7, rook to b2, not allowing the check. And the point is now if you go rook g7 to play rook g3, I can simply go rook b4 attacking the pawn. You're not in time with rook g3, and after king g5 to guard the pawn, I can just start checking you all over the board, and we get back to a situation like this, where again, I just sit and wait. I just basically sit and wait forever on the second rank. Whenever you go to h4, I keep waiting because the only infiltration is going to be from g7 and g3, and whenever you go over to the g file, there's always rook b4. So Gukesh plays rook d3, we get king g2, king g5 played here, rook to b5 check, he goes f5, Magnus goes back, covering the second rank, no kebabs allowed. We get king f6 here, and now Magnus plays h4, stopping any entry on the king side. Here we get king to e5, and now Magnus plays king to f2, and the game ends in a draw. Now, Gukesh could have tried to keep it going, but there aren't really many ways to try. If you go king d4, I check you on b4. If you go forward, you lose the pawn and probably the game. I mean, I guess it's still technically a draw with rook d5, but you can't go forward. If you go back, again, I can simply check, go rook b2, stopping the check. And whenever you come forward, I always check. And maybe you can try something like this with king d4 here, but I don't have to actually check here. I can go king to e2, stopping the king from getting in. If I were to check and you could get to this position, there are some small chances of maybe winning, because after check, you can block. And then there's rook to c2, forcing the trade. So if you could get this, you can win. But the problem is that here I can go king to e2, cutting you off, no king to d3. And if you go rook b5, it's the same story. I check you again. You have to go back to guard the pawn, and then I go back to the second rank. And there really is just no way to make progress. So for that reason, after king to f2, Gukesh takes the draw here. He is eliminated. Magnus moves on to the semifinals. A very scary game for Magnus at times. But when push came to shove, he showed his great resilience, great defensive resources in the endgame, does not panic, does not lose control. He's able to save it, and he does advance. Just I would say, not miraculous, but one of the first few times outside of the match against Cameron where I felt like Magnus was being maybe a little bit too optimistic, got a little bit carried away, but when it came down to it, he showed why he's the best player in the world by locking it down, even though it felt like it was slipping away. So Magnus defends, moves on to the semifinals. He will play against Nijat, I think, Abasov from Azerbaijan, who shocked Vidit Gujarati from India. Now, Abasov's having a great tournament. He's beaten Peter Savitler, Anish Giri, Vidit Gujarati. Assuming Magnus does not play in the Canada's tournament, that means that Nijat Abasov from Azerbaijan will qualify to play in the Canada's tournament despite having a rating of only 26.48. So a huge result for Abasov, causing upsets left and right. He will be playing Magnus Carlsen in the semis. Of course, I will be back to do a recap of that match when they start playing that match, I believe on Saturday, if I'm not mistaken, after a rest day. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already. And I'll be back with some more great recaps and YouTube-only content in the near future. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Bye.